My name is Sergei Sokolov. I'm from Ukraine, but here presenting the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I'm going to be on chair for the next talk. Nowadays we all hear about biorhythms, biowaves, chronobiology, about circadian rhythms. And it's my great pleasure to present author of these words, Professor Franz Halberg from the University of Minesota, who is also director of the Chronobiology Center. And he is just father of the whole field of a science which is called chronobiology, or to make it interdisciplinary, you may say also biochronology. I don't know. So, also it was a question today about why do we possess cycles and rhythms as living things. I think we can reformulate this question and to say that we don't possess rhythms, we are rhythms. We all are cycles. So in this respect, this talk is going to be very interesting because Professor Halberg realized this already in 40s of the last century. So please.
Thank you kindly, Dr. Sokolov. Thank you, Masatoshi. Thank you all for listening to some very unorthodox talk. It's all on this slide, and our chairman put it beautifully. We breathe, and that's trivial. Our rhythms in the brain are a fact, and we record them. What we couldn't do for a long time was to take an EEG and run it for years. We can now. We can now telemeter a little mouse for a lifetime from weaning. We can telemeter its EEG, its ECG, whatever you wish. Unfortunately, we cannot do it as yet for humans. Dr. Otsuka, who is part of this presentation, has 2 Japanese towers that are monitoring for 7 days around the clock blood pressure and heart rate. When you look at the data and do a linear nonlinear analysis, you find that 99% of the records have a 24-hour component with a 95% confidence interval that overlaps precisely 24 hours for all 3 variables, systolic, diastolic, and heart rate. What I'm going to show you now is very new, and I use the word unique advisedly. There is no other series or set of series that cover 40 years, that cover 40 about 5 times a day. And there are no other series that cover decades around the clock. This is the evidence on over 12 people, not on one, and on one for 40 years, that I shall present to you to discuss time structures that are not synchronized, that respond to frequencies in the solar wind that are within the thermal noise for all practical purposes, that our chairperson can probably appreciate best in all of this audience, since a very fine gentleman, Chichevsky, from his part of the world, preceded us in recognizing the importance of these phenomena. So to start out formally, life is really our rhythms. And in addition to what is usually said, I would like to add number 3. Perhaps we can contribute a little bit more information as the speaker before me did so beautifully, in giving primacy to RNA, which is also so very close to my heart. The next slide, please. We are not philosophers. Gauss said that when a philosopher says something, it's usually trivial, or he may be wrong. We are trying to document by mapping a set of new rhythms, and then by subtraction and addition that we carry out, that was 60 years ago, or that the sun carries out, and that is now, we look at the consequences for humans. And I shall respectfully submit to you that the consequences of what the sun is guilty for can include not only diseases of individuals, but diseases of societies. And in this case, we come from a meeting in the Crimea where, independently of us, Dr. Vladimirsky and Dr. Grigoriev documented that in human terrorism, adding to crime and war, the new frequencies of cycles longer than a year that predominate in some functions in Minesota also characterize that endeavor in human affairs. Next, please. Allow me to separate periodicities that surround us into those that you see and those that you usually do not see, except for auroras, photics and non-photics. They are still predictable, but they are very often intermittent. They have been called quasi-periodic in geophysics and in solar physics. But quasi-periodic or almost periodic functions are usually associated with some specific differential equation. Hence, I call them Aeolian after the king and ruler of the winds, Aeolus. Next, please. 1946 was the year when the gentleman who formulated the wave equation wrote his book, What is Life? What he ended up with was reference to clock in each of his concluding chapters. You can see it, he invoked in a virtual clock. At the same time, I was much thinner than I am now, and my chief wanted me to get some good food. And so he sent me to a colloquium, to a symposium on what is life. So I thank Dr. Murausu to come back so many years later and discuss what is life. But this is what I wrote in 1946. And in the intervening years, more than half of a century, I tried to fill in those periodic waves, except that they turned out to be not so simple. Next, please. We cover in the frequency domain 18 orders of magnitude. The newest cycles, to which Rodi and Muller added some with over 100 million year lengths in the extinction of genera on the ocean floor, include now one of about 37 million cycles, Kali Myriad Indian. What we find and what we postulated about 11 years ago was that for every cycle outside us, we might seek one in us, and vice versa. Thus, we did find solar signatures for almost any one periodicity that we looked for in the longest series available. By the same token, vice versa, we found, because of biology, because of epidemiology, because of autism and other conditions in psychiatry, because of psychology, mental functions, we found even a new periodicity in physics. One in something as common as geomagnetics, where the year had been documented usually because data were folded over year. But if you take the antipodal index AA from 1868 to now, then you find that the period is of 1.06 years, which we call a near trans year. There are also far trans years of 15 months or longer expense. Here are the methods. I shall not presume to show you the methods in one short lecture, but you can see here a very weak periodicity described from MIT in the solar wind by Richardson, found in the interplanetary magnetic field before Richardson by Gonzalez and Gonzalez. From here, over gliding, moving spectrum, you can get to a regular, usual, in our case, linear, nonlinear least square spectrum. So far, it's classical time series analysis. But just as you put two lenses together and you get a microscope, you can vary the interval in a moving spectrum, making it long or short. If you make it short, this being solar magnetism, you find a lot of variation. If you make the interval long, you will find a clear periodicity, clearly longer than a year, clearly characterizing solar magnetism, and clearly missed by all of those who do not use confidence intervals to look at what they try to measure. But this presentation is still time macroscopic, MA. You are still relying on your naked eye. What we need, whether we look at both numbers and sunspots or any other variable, we need the 95% confidence interval. And we have to belay, as in mountain climbing, every step we take, because the periodicities that we encounter, the aeolians, are intermittent, non-stationary. They change in frequency, drift, bifurcate, are lost. They change in intensity, they wax and wane. Here you see a sample of solar wind speed measured in satellites as a function of time from 1971 to 2007 for 40-some years. On the ordinate, you see the 1-year test period, trial period here, 0.7, 2.5 years there. So this is a scale of years. By the shading, you simply ask, is there a statistically significant rhythm? Calling it an ordering periodicity, but not plotting anything when there is no periodicity, in this case below the 0.001 level. Do my old eyes fail to see the point of... Okay, I see now. No. So you can see at 1 year that there isn't very much. But at 1.3 years, if I could think, you can see clearly at 1.3 years that there is a very great darkness, a statistically significant periodicity. You can also see that later in the years 2000 and earlier, at the same test frequency, there is nothing in the solar wind that we can describe as statistically significant. This is why we call them, if not quasi-periodic, then aeolian. The same thing for the antipodal geomagnetic index AA. In this particular case, and not ours, it simply mirrors the solar wind. Again, there is barely anything at precisely 1 year, and there is a big shading, but only part of the time, at 1.3 years. Now here we can go back to 1868 from 1971, and we find that it really appeared first around 1920. So every statement you make about aeolians has to be qualified for the span to which it applies. Next, please. Now we see for the same 40 years, blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, and heart rate of a young man when he started, now 60 years of age, whose father happened to measure also, starting in the 60s. So father and son go from 20 to 60 and from 65 to 87 or so, respectively. What you can see clearly here is a very strong yearly band. No question that photoperiodism prevails in diastolic blood pressure, in systolic blood pressure, and it prevails also in heart rate. There is still some shading left here. It goes through. Photoperiodism dominates. There are also some magnetoperiodisms, unquestionable, but second in importance. If you do a spectrum, the yearly component dominates by far the previous one. This is the time estimation, the 1 minute estimation of the same 20 to 60-year-old from 1971 to 2007. And you can see that again, just like, not quite, but almost, and exactly in a spectrum, like the solar wind speed, and like the geomagnetic index AA, at 1 year, he has practically nothing, and at 1.3 years, he has a very clear band exactly there where AA, the geomagnetic index, and solar wind speed show their shading. Next, 2. Thank you. Now, 1, please. If we take the same follows bigger over 40 years, mood or temperature, you will find again a year for some of the time, a calendar year, then it almost fades. Same for mood, vigor, and temperature. In you and me, and any one subject we studied, 12 of them, 48 series, each covering decades, invariably we find transients. As you will see in some phenomena in Minesota, with a strong winter and reasonably warm summers, the transient dominates over the year, over the calendar year, in sudden cardiac deaths, in suicide. So we are dealing with unseen periodicities that we can wrap up with inferential statistics that are aeolian, quasi-periodic, intermittent, but that are of sufficient importance that I took quite a bit of your time to make the point that contrary to circadian rhythms, where you have 99% synchronization, here you have an almost invariable desynchronization as the physiologic state of affairs, and you have competing in one and the same person different frequencies, photic and non-photic ones. Next, please. You have to be extremely cautious, and as a note of caution, I give you the father. Until now, you saw the sun. Now, here are the data of the father in the morning. He measured only twice a day, and before going to bed. At bedtime, you see a very strong peak at half a year that our chairman will recognize as a geomagnetic signature. Very clearly, the Earth is more exposed to the sun at the equinoxes. But if you look for the same peak in the spectrum in the morning level, also covering 22 years, you find the valley. So when you do a spectrum for aeolians, can make the difference between a large peak or a valley. To sum up what I tried to say until now, on the left you see a number of periodicities that are in textbooks. On the right you could see a number of periodicities, many of them brand new, but characterizing features as important as the circadians are now recognized to be, tipping the scale between death and survival. Down to 1 million years from the range of the EEG down to trans years and many others in between. I mentioned in the discussion in response to Professor Diemer the fact that there are in stalagmites and in climatic change 500-year cycles, just one of the very many. Next, please. What does it mean to the practice of medicine? This is what Kuniaki Otsuka said so beautifully. It does mean that concepts such as you're getting a laboratory result that is okay because it's below an upper limit and above a lower limit is acceptable. It isn't. Much of your early changes, a whole set of new syndromes, lies in this very range of normalcy, presumed normalcy. A curtain of ignorance that is drawn over the very function in which normal function occurs. Now, the newspapers now speak of biologic clocks and calendars. Just the tip of the iceberg. Yes, they are very important. Yes, it was a bloody fight in 1950 when circadian was Halberg's paranoia to get across the notion that indeed when you do something plays a role. But when Eisenhower sent some grain to India and we had some rupees to burn up there and we studied when to eat, we found that if you eat the same 2,000 calories in the morning, you lose weight, and if you eat them in the evening, there is a relative weight gain. The whole field of chromotherapy developed from circadian rhythms. But now the job is so much tougher because we have a 3-component system. Chaos, part of it deterministic. Trends that I show best by my aging, by my being happy that I don't have to go up a podium and need some help to go up the podium. And of course, those many cycles that we discussed, that Kamide-san, to whom I thank for being here, would say we live in the atmosphere of the sun. Next. you see how the data really look. On the left, Wolf numbers, the sunspot cycle that Galileo missed and Schwabe found. The solar wind speed that looks much more irregular, and here the bipolarity sunspot cycle when you simply change the sign from one cycle to the next. But worse than the solar wind are heart rates or diastolic or systolic pressures. By doing some analysis, you can pull out for the naked eye to ascertain yourself that what you see is not a computational artifact. But the next step is some measure that you need in these wobbly things, and we call it congruence. Congruence of periods, when two phenomena exhibiting a similar period have 95% confidence intervals that either overlap or overlie each other. Congruence is the only way to proceed, and you need some measure of uncertainty. And I sincerely hope that in circadians also there will be a sine qua non to document this, because without congruence we cannot make the first step and then check with a subtraction additional approach. The congruence you find between the hair cycle, the Wolf numbers, geomagnetics on the one hand, and the human circulation on the other hand, during 40 years, where on the abscissa you plot period, is surprising. Between sunspot numbers and heart rate, there is a clear overlaying of the former of the latter, 95% confidence interval. Again, for heart rate, at a different frequency, we have a correspondence with the hair cycle. For blood pressure, you have at yet another frequency a correspondence with the hair cycle, and at yet other frequencies with geomagnetics. In other words, if you look at the longest periods in a 40-year long period, it may be chance, we cannot rule it out, but for each of the longest periods, there is an environmental period, either in geomagnetics or in solar wind speed. Next. The problem in dealing with congruence is enormous. Because if you have 2,556 years of wars, of course you have a very artificially very small 95% confidence interval. We also have a few hundred years of sunspots, so we have a narrow confidence interval. So one of the rules when you compare for congruence is, of course, to have the same time series length. Next, please. Here we see congruence in Professor Katinas, who came to Minesota in the 70s and came back for the last 10 years after being the head of the department in St. Petersburg. You can see that his major peaks in his systolic blood pressure mean, we call it meso, or in his double systolic blood pressure amplitude, have a congruent period in solar wind speed. Next. Of course, it could be chance. This is myself, starting when I was 70 with this particular instrument that I carry in my pocket. But again, you see a surprising congruence. No conclusions are drawn. Next slide, please. Next. 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 Before we try to make some tentative inferences, I would like to congratulate the previous speaker in public as I did in private, most enthusiastically. And you will see why I'm so eager to become his student. There are two kinds of organisms that we encounter. In some, the week is bigger than the day. Perhaps Moses and Jesus and Mohammed were very good physiologists when they picked the Sabbaths. For sure, in acetabularia, acetabulum, eukaryotic giant alga, this is the day, and this is the week. This is the amplitude of the week, this is the amplitude of the day. So the only conclusion we can tentatively draw, but then Akio will come with a rule and say, I'm going to do it with my RNA, you keep quiet. So I'm looking for his RNA, but also looking for his data. Is it that bacteria that have a big circadian and a small circumcision show the opposite behavior of some eukaryote that has been here 500 million years ago? This is extremely tentative history of life, and I'm looking forward to learning from Kyoto University, if I can, and inserting the answer to this question mark. Next. From phylogenesis, we go to ontogenesis. Perhaps Haeckel was right when he said that the phylogenesis is repeated in ontogenesis. It may not apply to form, but it certainly applies to function. These are the first 40 days of Fumihiko Watanabe. Dr. Watanabe, a colleague of Dr. Otsuka, measures himself for 18 years, but he also measured his son. And these are the periods that predominated during those first 40 days of life. You can see that at 24 hours to start with, you have very little shading, very little red. It takes a few weeks before the circadian rhythm appears. But you can also see that the week is there most prominently when the day is very, very small. We have another 161 babies in Florence, a considerable number in Minesota and in Moscow, to say that this is a general phenomenon. Not only in humans, but also in pigs, in rats, and in a crab. In a crab, the week stays dominant up to 6 months of life in its activity. But we cannot go by confidence intervals and share statistics. What we have to do is to look at mechanisms, and the only way I know is to remove and replace. This is what happened in 1950. Lame people could walk again. A Nobel Prize was given for cortisone, so there were no human committees, so you could remove adrenals in the name of science and research. So these are people without adrenals. This is their serum iron as percent of mean, and if you represent it as a vector, it still is a statistically significant rhythm, albeit as compared to healthy people, the phase is advanced and the amplitude is statistically significantly shortened. By contrast, on patients with adrenals removed, the 95% confidence ellipse covers the pole, just validating that there is a nearly straight line in eosinophil counts. that we see again the differential effect of removing and replacing a gland. One variable, some blood cell counts, lose their periodicity, the others change amplitude and phase. The adrenal turned out to be very important, and eventually, how much time do I have, Mr. Chairman?
About 6 minutes.
About 6 minutes.
What?
5, 6 minutes.
How many?
Okay, 6 or 8. Just go, please.
Okay. A friend collected his urine for 15 years. You see his circadian rhythm, you see a trans-yearly rhythm, and you see even the solar cycle reflected in it. The transients can be seen better here and here. The peaks are away from 1 year. This would be the scheme if I had the time to discuss the details of the circadian system. But the next one shows, the next one, please. The next one shows, except the previous one was from Dr. Takumi of Osaka, so I should really mention his beautiful contribution. But here you see how aeolian cycles act upon us. They act upon the hypothalamus, where we could document that melatonin rhythmicity has an increased amplitude and mean. They act upon the pineal, where we published that the amplitude and measure or mean of melatonin are decreased. They act upon water, they act upon the adrenal, they act upon myocardial infarction, sudden cardiac death, cardiac arrhythmias, a long story. I shall try to complete my discussion with a remove and replace approach done by the sun. Here the sun does have a week, and the amplitude is large, of an about 7-day rhythm. Here the sun does not, and the amplitude is small. Next, please. The same for 5 more people. Next, please. And this is me. Again, this is again the solar wind. And the solar wind has a 1.3-year period, which at this point is lost. 1.3 years later, I lose part, not all of my 1.3 transient. There were 5 cases with the week. There is 1 case with a transient. We need so much more. We have just begun. I finish with human affairs. And this is proper for Satoshi, because this is quantum physics. The Princeton Group in physics has 70 random event generators all over the world. And they record deviations from entropy. They record, in addition, mass events that involve emotions of very many people. And if now you plot the entropy change on the ordinal, on the abscissa you take a complex measure of the interplanetary magnetic field developed by Professor Hans Wendt, who is responsible for this graph, for its concept as well as for its execution. Then you find that there is a P that he now corrected. It was 0.001 with an R of 0.6. He now tells me it's 0.99. So it's too good to be true. But could it be that the ears of society may also be influenced by the cosmos? Krzyzewski claimed it for a long time. Concomitantly with Hans Wendt, Dr. Cornelis in our laboratory analyzed the Homeland Security database. She found the transient, but before her, Grigoriev and Radimirsky found the transient and reported it in Sudak. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you a story that is much more interesting than this 88-year-old could convey to you. My PowerPoint with much more information is with Professor Braus. You're welcome to write to me, and I'll be always most grateful for your critique. Arigato.
Thank you very much, Professor Halberg, for this interesting talk. I'm sure that we can use this data not only in our scientific activity, but also in everyday life. Just keep it in mind. So now we are open for discussion. Who has questions or comments? Or, okay.
Yeah, I'm over here. Yes. Let's accept the correlations that you've shown us and ask about causal interactions between, for instance, solar wind interactions with the upper atmosphere, and how that might possibly interact with human affairs, such as violence that you see here. I'm sure you've thought about possible correlations, and perhaps other people here have as well. I think it'd be interesting to compare notes. Skepticism arises because the solar wind is such a tiny fraction of the total amount of solar energy that hinges on the Earth. And you really have to try to find some sort of hypothetical way to transmit this tiny fraction of energy down to human affairs. I wonder if you've thought about that.
Thank you kindly for a very generous question. We deal practically with thermal noise. There are many people who say that it just isn't possible. We are empiricists. We have to build some hypotheses. Ross Avey started at a much, much higher frequency by suggesting certain windows. The best non-scientific way to answer your question is the lady who just had a baby and lives near a train station and sleeps through all of those trains. Well, the baby whimpers and she wakes up. We are sensitive at certain frequencies. Why else should cardiac defibrillators in Minesota show a transient pattern and not a yearly? Why else should sudden cardiac deaths show it? Why else should suicide in Minnesota show it? To my relief, Tokyo shows it too, but not all other places. Appleton put it beautifully. The Earth is round, not flat. The Earth moves, it's not fixed. The Earth is a heterogeneous magnet, and the big sun also is very. So we have latitudinal and longitudinal differences that we can expect in almost anything we do. But to now attempt to answer your question in a slightly more specific and not roundabout hedging way, I went into the detail with that 48-year series because the mental function showed the same pattern, the identical pattern in the global spectrum. But I didn't want to cheat, I wanted to show the differences too. As suicide, as cardiac arrest. So we must have receptors. And we identified one by chance because in one of the not so long ago studies that we did around the clock for 7 days, every 4 hours, killing poor rats every 4 hours, removing their hypothalamus and removing their pineal. We did find indeed that the hypothalamus does respond. It's extremely low melatonin content notwithstanding to magnetic storm, gained by BST and KP whatever. So we have really tangible mechanisms. Hypothalamic melatonin. We actually can take it to humans because one of my students, who is now professor in Alta Norway, has studied urine of her students. And in Alta, out of 7 days, you have 1 day with a magnetic storm as a minimum, usually more. So, as in the rat pineal, the melatonin excretion in her students, during magnetic storm is dampened. So far, our shirt extends. Thank you very much for your kind question.
Just a quick follow-up. We saw a quote of Theodosius Dobzhansky, "Nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution." Now, if there are receptors, as you suggest, we should manage to find some evolutionary aspect that would make us sensitive to this. Perhaps sensitive to something else, so the correlation arises not directly from the interaction of these solar phenomena with human activities, but through some other aspect of our biosphere that we live in.
That's an extremely good point, and our common friend, whom I didn't meet yet, Friedemann Frank, of course, claims that vortices up in the ionosphere hit his stresses in producing telluric currents, and then he has his concept of deficient electrons that go sideways, and after decent electrons that go downward, close a circuit, and they even bring about an earthquake. So, yes, it could be a telluric current, it could be some other effect. We have lots to do. But I would like to ask one favor of the chairman. I would like to make a point in following up on Dr. Otsuka. There is a bird in hand, and many of you who are here, I'm looking at you, sir, and a few others, who are my age, not quite, you are young, but some of you are being treated with high blood pressure. Some of you are trading a risk greater than high blood pressure for a normal blood pressure. So what is going on in Kochi and Hokkaido could go on in Ann Arbor and wherever, in Santa Cruz. That's my plea for Dr. Otsuka on a very practical basis.
Okay. Anybody ask something? Okay, maybe I have questions also. In which units did you measure entropy and entropy change?
We did not measure. The Princeton physics group, Young and Nelson, did the measurements. So those are their data.
Okay.
And thank you for the question, because I still would like to answer Professor Diemel. I owed it to Hans Wendt, who did this, to show it. But we, among many others, have shown that if you have periodic functions and you show such a correlation, you shake in your boots, because this, here it would be positive and here it would be negative. If two periodic functions are out of phase. So this slide, Mr. Chairman, is supported by the two independent studies that give us trends here in the big database of Homeland Security. So in that light, I think this correlation is much more than a possible nonsense correlation, like between the number of storks in North Carolina and the number of babies.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
Your data on the weekly cycles fascinating, especially when it applies to acetabularia. Can you distinguish between the consequences of human activity and some other extra-human factor generating the weekly cycle? The actual effect of human life today on the biosphere and on it, and the weekly cycle which dominates the civilization around the globe must be generating periodicities in carbon dioxide, in electromagnetism and all sorts of things, which could be the direct effect even on acetabularia and not anything coming from the sun, for example, or from the moon.
Thank you for the question. We can CAN because we can show with statistical significance that the period of acetabularia deviates from precisely 7 days. So there is some tangible numerical, inferential, statistical suggestion that this is not human affairs. We have another situation where we cannot, where we are extremely interested, at the Max Planck in Göttingen, Dr. Ulmer, who is now working for a very fine theoretical physicist, has 2 more spheroids that are precisely 7-day synchronized. So there we cannot, there we are flat on our backs. But it's still a beautiful way to suggest to one of the speakers who spoke about radiotherapy, to time this radiotherapy. Thank you.
Yes.
Your talk is very stimulating. Thank you so much. And your talk is again evoking the problem of nature and versus nurture. Just like Nick's question, it is very important to distinguish the noise origin. Inside noise or outside noise, or inside fluctuation reason or outside fluctuation, and distinguish between inside and outside sources. Very important because there are so many contradictory experiments to be studied, to be explained, and sometimes such contradictory experimental results ignored, but I do very believe that the presence of contradictory results themselves have many important meanings. So thank you for your good talk. Remind us the presence of such important suggestions. And do you know, when we consider about experimental factors, we generally ignore long-range fluctuations or short-time noises, but such fluctuation or such noise may be very interesting and important to reconsider once again. So do you have any suggestion to us to do or to make some experimental design for future dimension?
I think that what Masatoshi just presented is extremely important, and I didn't have a chance to discuss it, and thank you for letting me do it. and again I blow the horn of Uniqueness, because if the data are dense enough, say if you have an electrocardiogram, then Kuniaki did take electrocardiograms, did compute a correlation dimension, so he did determine chaos. He determined that for most people would have been noise. He determined probabilistic chaos, and he could, on that basis, separate two groups of heart patients from normal people. So what you say, focusing upon noise, is actually very productive.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody like to ask something? No comments anymore. Okay, then we are very thankful once more for your interesting talk. And we wish you other investigations, and we are thankful not only for this talk, but for all you've done and you are doing.